Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Just finished up talking NBA for the day. We will now be moving on to the NFL and with the Buffalo Bills. Just a reminder for any of our live viewers to feel free to use the comment section, give in your opinions, and make this show as interactive as possible. But talking about the Bills here, they made some headlines yesterday by making a series of moves that included releasing 6 players in order to try and get their salary cap situation put together. They were about $40 million over the cap headed into yesterday. So they took some action in order to try and fix that to at least some degree. They still sit over the salary cap today, but they had to make some moves to at least move this in a positive direction for them. Some of the names that were released that were most notable were Jordan Poyer, their safety, Tre'Davious White, and Mitch Morse, their center. They also released Deontay Hardy, who has been a key special teams player for them for the past few seasons. They also released Nyheim Hines and Siren Neal as well. They restructured their contract with Von Miller as well to try and get this thing right. But like I mentioned, despite all of these moves, they are still currently over the salary cap. This moves them closer once Tre'Davious White's contract clears, which will be in the summer. It will approximately free up $37 million, but they are not going to be done with moves. There has been some speculation about a Stephon Diggs trade as well, so we will get into all of that. But as far as the conclusion of some of these moves that have actually taken place, you have Jordan Poyer, who did take a step back last season. He is still probably in that upper echelon of safeties in the NFL. Now, he didn't have quite as good of a season as his past couple years where he was an All-Pro 2 seasons ago. He was, 3 seasons ago now, a Pro Bowler 2 years ago, and last year was a solid player for them, but wasn't quite the same impact. And he's 32 years old, so sort of the natural age regression with him. He was still very solid in the run game, but not the same level of passing defender. And he was set to take up $7 million in the cap space for them, so they decided to let him go. Tre'Davious White, another guy in their secondary that they are moving on from. White was one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL for a couple years there, but injuries have been the big-time story with him. He tore his Achilles about midway through this past season. He had torn his ACL in 2021 and just hasn't really been able to stay on the field for this Bills team that is hoping to be Super Bowl contenders. And while both of these players in the secondary have been effective for them, it just hasn't resulted in the postseason success. Notable that the other starting safety they had, Micah Hyde, is in expiring contract, so he will be a free agent this summer as well. So we could see a lot of turnover with this. And to avoid being too gimmicky here in terms of this conversation now is being asked, is the Buffalo Bills championship window closed? I will always think that as long as you have one of those top tier quarterbacks, which I believe they do have a top 3 guy in Josh Allen, to say that now the Bills cannot win a Super Bowl, I think that is an overreaction. Now, the odds are absolutely stacked against them, and if you replay how this past season went a handful of times after the slow start that they had to the year, then you can definitely make an argument that the more times you play this out, they probably don't make the playoffs, the Bills do, because they were, of course, really struggling in the first half of the regular season. They were 5-5, they were 6-6, and a lot of things had to break in the right way in order for them to make the playoffs, and ultimately they did. They cleaned up their business as well, winning their last 5 games of the regular season. But some of those other teams that were competitive for the 7th seed weren't able to do so. The Jaguars fell off big time. The Steelers, who did make the playoffs actually, but even them, they were competing with a team there who had a quarterback injury, quarterback controversy, whatever you want to call it, between once Pickett was back and it was Mason Rudolph taking over and all of that. But you just had a lot of these other teams that were in contention fall out. You had Joe Burrow go down with his second injury of the season. I just think overall as a whole, when you look at how this Bills season played out, to imagine that they ended up being the 2 seed was pretty incredible. So that being said, I still feel like if injuries aren't the same in the playoffs, losing a lot of their linebackers as well, that things still could have gone better for them. But ultimately, the conversation is with the Bills here. You are in the same conference as Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, and that is sort of the measuring stick here, where it is for Josh Allen and it is for the franchise as a whole, the way that we have seen the Chiefs retool around Patrick Mahomes. Now, I don't even want to give the front office too much credit in some points, because some of the receiver moves that they made were definitely not good. They were able to survive off of having this all-time talent in Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. They had Travis Kelce, who wasn't quite as effective as we've seen in the past, but once the playoffs came around, there was still that relationship between him and Mahomes. Kelce is still good enough to be an effective player, but they were able to sort of shift their identity this past season to having an elite defense. And this was a defense that I don't think I fully gave enough credit to for a lot of the year. We knew how good their secondary was. They had some good linebackers, but it didn't, just based off of the numbers, their run game against the run, that was something that I was way too fixated on, I think, for a lot of the year. And ultimately, it was their defense that really carried them all through the playoff run. And it was an incredible job, I think, for them to be able to pivot after being the high-flying offense with Patrick Mahomes, and still having Patrick Mahomes, of course, but we talked about some of the stats with Russell Wilson when we looked at the shift of offense that they had during the course of the season, and how his air yards per pass were in the bottom 4 of the NFL. Patrick Mahomes was even lower in terms of air yards per completion, and that was because of the fact that the defense wasn't really, or the receivers, that is, weren't really to be trusted in the same position, and the fact that they also knew that they could rely on a defense. And as opposed to the first few years of Mahomes' career, where he could just throw the long ball to a burner like Tyreek Hill and have him do the rest, it was a lot more methodical driving. Luckily, they had an improved run game with Isaiah Pacheco, who, again, was a late-round pick for them as well, so it's not even like they knew that this was going to be a home run swing for them. They had Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who was a first-round pick for them a handful of years ago, but they found the running back late in the draft that was able to carry the workload for them and ultimately help put them into a position where they won back-to-back Super Bowls. So it's hard to be critical of the Chiefs front office there, but then when you look at the Bills, now they're going to have to come back into this sort of altered state where they need to find a way to rebuild around Josh Allen. And I think rebuild is almost even a little bit of a stretch, where it's not like they need to tear down their entire roster and start over. It's just a matter of they're going to need to especially hit on some of these draft picks, because they've been a little bit hit or miss over the course of the past handful of years. They have drafted just 2 all-pro players in the past. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think it's when you go back to 2017. It was whatever draft with Tre'Davious White and Matt Milano. Since then, they have not drafted an all-pro player for themselves. Now, they've done a fine job of sort of working around the edges, signing some former guys with draft pedigree, and bringing them in to be effective players for them. But in terms of actually homegrown talent, we just haven't seen it yet. Maybe Gregory Rousseau makes a jump for them. He's somebody who they drafted in the first round a couple years ago, and he's shown some flashes, but he hasn't been the elite round 1 edge rusher. And, it's hard as well. They draft in the latter half of the first round every year as well, so it's not like they're getting necessarily chances for those home run swinging players. But you still need to do more, take advantage of some of these cheaper contracts in terms of your production, especially as Josh Allen's salary is going to take a massive jump with his contract extension, which also sort of brings me into the conversation about Stefon Diggs and how this situation is going to play out for them. Because Stefon Diggs, for as great of a talent as we know that he is, some of the production, in the playoffs as a whole, hasn't been necessarily tremendous since coming to the Bills. The playoffs hasn't really been there, but he is still, this year especially too, with some of the regular season stuff, he just sort of fell off a cliff some, and now he's going to be making almost $28 million for the Bills next season, and that's a lot of money to cough up to one guy in particular. What are they going to do in terms of keeping him on the books? They still have some ways to go in terms of getting under the financial cap, and I think that it is going to be a very interesting thing to see how this all plays out for them. Peacock is in the chat right now talking about hearing Russell Wilson to the Steelers. We'll briefly touch on this. This is something that we'll talk about a little bit in the final segment as well. They are looking to meet the two parties later in the week, but it is interesting because Russell Wilson seems like he would be a pretty good fit there in the Pittsburgh Steelers offense and the franchise. But at the same time, we've had multiple reports come out about the fact that the Steelers don't want to bring in a veteran quarterback. The Athletic just put out an article yesterday talking about how they are not interested in bringing in Wilson. The 3 that were listed was Wilson, Kirk Cousins, and Baker Mayfield, where I can understand it to some degree. I'm not entirely out on Kenny Pickett as a quarterback. I think that you should have somebody else in the building to put a little bit of pressure on him. Now, to what level of a quarterback is that? Russell Wilson's interesting because I definitely think that he still could potentially find himself playing some decent football for a team that is looking to actually elevate in the playoffs. The Steelers have all of these seasons where they avoid going under 500. They make the playoffs, but haven't won a playoff game in years now, and Russell Wilson could potentially be that. But there is also the fact of the matter that having Russell Wilson as a backup quarterback, if you were to go on the strategy that I think that the Steelers should do in keeping Kenny Pickett on the roster, but trying to light a fire under him a little bit, Russell Wilson would be a little bit of a distracting backup quarterback, in my opinion. So there's a lot of different conflicting things when it comes to the Wilson conversation. I'm really not sure how this is going to play out. I think that there is a chance that he could end up not being on a team in this offseason, continuing to work out and potentially finding his way back onto a roster should there be an injury to a starting quarterback elsewhere. Because again, I do think that he could potentially still have some good football in him, but for some of these franchises that have open quarterback positions, it might be tough to justify going with Wilson, even though he may be willing to take a cheap deal. So that is definitely a, positive, I suppose, if you are a franchise considering this. But we will get more to the Steelers and this Wilson meeting. We will be touching on all of the other big releases from the NFL that took place over the course of the past 24 hours when we come back on the other side of this break. So stick with us, and we'll be right back.